Welcome everyone to this webinar on recoding our understanding of responsible business conduct in science, technology, and innovation. My name is Alan Jorgensen, and I'm head of the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct. Please note we are recording this webinar, so if you like what you hear, please do share it. The purpose of our webinar today is really twofold. It is, first of all, to unbox the updated OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct, with a distinct focus on what the guidelines have to say about science, technology, and innovation. And secondly, to really hear from policymakers and practitioners who can help us take stock of the implementation of responsible business conduct when it comes to science, technology, and innovation. The OECD Responsible Business Conduct is about promoting business conduct that supports sustainable markets based on respect for human rights and protection of the environment. And this is particularly critical in the technology sector, where perhaps there is a sense that private actors are well ahead of policymakers and really reshaping societies and economies at a faster pace than governments can perhaps keep up with. One way to deal with accelerated change is, of course, to have principles that are timeless. International human rights norms are embedded into both OECD and United Nations framework on responsible business conduct and business and human rights, respectively. But these frameworks, of course, need to be implemented by policymakers and the industry alike. So by way of scene setting, let me offer up three reflections before handing over for the discussion. First, the discussion goes well beyond what we normally call the tech sector. Developers of technology, of course, have a special role, but all companies are potentially technology companies who may be financing, buying, selling, or using technology. Today we'll be focusing on how to responsibly govern the ecosystems in which technology is developed, sold, and used. The international frameworks that we already have on responsible business conduct and on business and human rights enable us to be pretty specific about the roles and responsibilities required of the individual actors in order for the system as a whole to work. They also provide us with a kind of bridging framework between the technology sector and technology companies, as it were, in other sectors. Second, given the complexity of the issues, the pace of change, and different domestic approaches, implementing responsible governance of technology ecosystems will require a smart mix of measures, including self-regulation, collective action, domestic policy and regulation, combined, very importantly, with strong institutions. And today we'll be hearing how this smart mix is really shaping up. Third, and finally, we'll also be hearing what the actors are doing to ensure alignment and coherence of these different efforts with international standards, so that the smart mix really stays clever and does not become, as it were, a spaghetti bowl of different initiatives that will be less effective in addressing the issues and may unduly also stifle innovation. You may know that G7 statements this year highlighted really the necessity, for example, of interoperability among AI governance frameworks. Given the variety of approaches we're already seeing, we're really asking the questions of how can industry and policymakers achieve this interoperability, and how can we think about interoperability at a global level, also including as many countries as possible. One of the key OECD contributions to this discussion is to act as a standard setter and a platform for cooperation and alignment among policymakers and practitioners. And the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises on responsible business conduct is, of course, our key foundation and standard in this regard. The guidelines are recommendations by governments directly to businesses in a range of areas related to responsible business conduct, related to both human rights, labor standards, the environment, governance, disclosure, and also science, technology, and innovation. The guidelines were this year updated for the first time since 2011, and the updated version was released in June of this year. And the purpose, as I said initially, of our webinar today, the primary purpose is to really go into depth about what the guidelines have to say about science, technology, and innovation, and responsible business conduct, due diligence in this regard. So on that note, let me hand over to Rashad Abelson, who's technology lead at the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct. Rashad, you will be unboxing for us the science and technology innovation chapter of the guidelines, what has changed, and also taking us through the discussion with our great panels. Thank you, Rashad. Over to you.
Thank you, Alan, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone logged on and joining this discussion. So let's dive right into the new text of the chapter and unpack what this all means for companies and governments and other stakeholders, and also share with you a little bit at the end on how the OECD is operationalizing this chapter through our new project on responsible AI. As a very brief background, so the previous chapter on science and technology was last updated in the 1990s. The entire guidelines saw an update after that. They're updated relatively about once every 10 years, but the chapter on science and tech was last updated in the 90s. And the focus of that chapter was on the benefits of technology transfer associated with foreign investment and trade. It was quite short. It was just made up of a few clauses that focused on how companies could support science and technological innovation in the countries where they operate. But that was about it. For impacts related to technology, stakeholders using the guidelines had to rely on other chapters on labor, human rights, or environment in order to understand company expectations. But those are obviously quite broad and maybe not the most suited to handle increasingly complex tech-related issues. The chapter in its previous form did not discuss the adverse impacts of technology. It did not discuss due diligence expectations of the guidelines, and it didn't mention the internet. So what's new? Well, quite a lot. This chapter saw some of the most significant changes as part of the overall update. And one could say that it was a recoding of our understanding of RBC applied to this area. I'm sorry for that pun, but I'm also very proud of it. Can we go to the next slide, please? First of all, and probably most importantly, the chapter now clarifies that the due diligence expectation extends to all actors involved in the technology value chain. As Alan said, and it's worth repeating, the notion of what a technology company is has changed significantly. In a lot of ways, all companies are now technology companies. That includes the developers and the financiers of tech products and services, but also the sellers and the users. The chapter now also links directly to other chapters of the M&E guidelines, as well as other OECD legal instruments on science, tech, and innovation. In effect, this means the issue scope of the chapter now includes adverse impacts linked to AI, online platforms, the collection and use of data, scientific research, innovation, digital security, as well as impacts related to the other chapters of the guidelines on labor, environment, consumer health, safety, and disclosure. And then when it comes to the original language on technology transfer, those provisions were kept, but were also bolstered to better reflect the current reality and geopolitics of the global tech landscape, including the importance of protecting intellectual property rights and mutual agreed terms of transfer during the tech transfer process. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll get into detail on some of these issues. So the changes in this chapter now make clear that all actors involved in the development, finance, sale, licensing, trade, and use of technology should be conducting due diligence to address the impacts linked to those activities. This also includes digital infrastructure providers and actors in the entire data ecosystem. This concept of due diligence on business relationships and a whole of supply chain approach to due diligence in the sector is somewhat unique to RBC instruments, and it's emphasized several times in the text of this chapter. In many of the international national standards on tech that have been developed, we don't really see this concept of due diligence across the value chain or due diligence on business relationships, even several tiers away, really addressed as clearly or spelled out as clearly. The guidelines are really take a strong effort to understand the responsibilities of every segment of the value chain, including the relevant enabling forces of the technology. We can go to the next slide, please. So let's take a look at how this approach would work in AI value chains, for example. As with a lot of digital technology, value chains aren't linear. AI value chains aren't linear, and many actors fit into multiple segments of the supply chain simultaneously. But for the sake of illustration, let's take a very simplified AI value chain, which we could envision as shown on the slide. In the bottom left box, you have suppliers of AI knowledge and resources. This could include actors in the data ecosystem, data set and model creators, and the open source community that develop prepackaged code. But it could also include investors, so those supplying financial capital to AI developers. It could include hardware manufacturers like chip makers and others who supply physical capital. And it also includes digital infrastructure providers like internet service providers, each with their own specific due diligence role to play when identifying and addressing risks. In the box at the top, you have actors in the AI system lifecycle. These are essentially the companies involved in designing, developing, and deploying AI systems. And then in the bottom right, you have the users. And these aren't just necessarily tech firms. These are healthcare companies, they're financial institutions, manufacturers, governments, law enforcement, university researchers, marketing firms, law firms, the list goes on. And each of these groups of actors should be conducting due diligence to identify and address impacts across the value chain. They would be looking at their own operations, products, and services, but also at those of their business relationships. So let's take data suppliers, for example, in that first, the bottom left box. They could be looking at their own operations for risks of privacy violations or bias in how the data is collected and curated. But they would also be looking at how the AI system lifecycle actors that they're selling the data to are designing and deploying systems using the data that they provided. And then finally, they'd also use that relationship to try to understand and identify the ultimate users of the products that contain inputs based on their data and make sure that those products are used responsibly. Just as well, the AI lifecycle actors and the end users would be evaluating their own operations, but also looking at each other to ensure responsibility in the entire value chain. So does that, that means are the inputs, are the data inputs gathered responsibly? Is the product designed responsibly? Is it being sold and used responsibly? As you can imagine, this approach is most effective when the responsibility cascades up and down and across value chains to cover all actors. This results in expectations being reinforced and action followed up on. Let's change to the next slide, and I can go over a little more about what the guidelines say about how due diligence is conducted specifically in these contexts. So the due diligence provisions in the commentary of this chapter provide some really helpful detail on the application of the risk-based approach with regards to the use of technology. Specifically, they say that due diligence should, quote, also take into account known or reasonably foreseeable circumstances related to the use of the product or service provided in accordance with its intended purpose or under conditions of reasonably foreseeable improper use or misuse. That language on reasonable foreseeability helps focus due diligence on the use of products in practical ways. The whole purpose of the guidelines is that they're meant to be practical and implementable. And so this risk-based approach based off of reasonable foreseeability in the use is really critical. One other thing to know about use is how this provision practically interacts with other provisions in the guidelines, specifically in Chapter 2, which state that enterprises can still contribute to an adverse impact even when there is no business relationship with the individual users. So efforts can be made prior to the point of sale in order to prevent and mitigate risks. So for example, that could potentially include mitigating risks through modifying the design of the product, restricting who the product is sold to, or modifying how the product is marketed. Although this chapter applies to both digital and non-digital technology, digital tech represents a really interesting situation where firms maintain oftentimes ongoing relationships with users and stronger leverage on user behavior. For example, through software updates or maintaining network connections or maintaining tech support. It's an interesting feature of the sector that opens up new opportunities and new interesting ways to address risk and impacts and to leverage positive change. Can we go to the next slide, please? So some really helpful illustrative examples that were frequently raised when the chapter was being developed and negotiated over the last few years are two use cases which I've highlighted here. So one is the use of lost item tracking technology, and the other is the deployment of social media algorithms. So I'll start with this lost item tracking technology. And essentially, these are devices that you can put on bikes or backpacks or luggage in order to track their movements. Over the last couple of years, reports started popping up of women in particular finding them on their cars and bikes and not knowing who they belong to, resulting in a clear infringement of their rights to privacy. And in some cases that were reported, it resulted in physical harm. This is a pretty obvious misuse of the product, one that I can imagine, be easily foreseen, but also one that was regularly reported in the media and by consumer safety experts. In those cases, the product manufacturer doesn't have a business relationship with the individual users of the product, but they are still responsible for contributing to the impact and can mitigate reasonably foreseeable misuse of those products by modifying the design to allow people to be aware if they're being tracked. And there are technical ways of doing that have been recommended by experts. Those technical solutions and risk mitigation solutions, risk prevention solutions, may have been identified if more due diligence was done in the innovation and design phase of the product before it went to market. The same goes for social media algorithms, which are designed to spread media in order to boost engagement of users with certain profiles. In some countries or in some languages, media is largely controlled by government authorities and used to spread state news and state propaganda. In other cases, there were reports of users in an organized way manipulating algorithms to spread misinformation and disinformation. There were cases where this has been linked to serious harm against certain minority groups or had impacts on the democratic process. Had effective due diligence been done pre-deployment or even after deployment, the algorithm could potentially have been modified to prevent certain media posts from spreading and mitigating or even preventing the impacts. These are obviously oversimplified examples for illustrative purposes, but they clearly demonstrate the new scenarios that the recommendations of the chapter can clearly apply to. It's also important to note here that a lot of companies are already doing this, but with this update, the expectations are now clear, they're coherent, they're adhered to by 51 governments who had signed on to this instrument, and the stakes are now higher. Can we go to the next slide, please? So it's just the final update that I'd like to highlight for you is the scope of the impacts now explicitly addressed by the chapter. There are a lot of impacts listed here, probably too many for one slide, but this really helps illustrate my point. The chapter now makes clear that impacts in the technology value chain link with other chapters of the guidelines. So you'll see on that left-hand column. That includes chapters on disclosure, environment, labor and industrial relations, and consumer interests, among others. And then further, the chapter references other key OECD recommendations on science, tech, and innovation, which each have their own relevant scope with regards to impacts. So these include, for example, the OECD AI principles, which cover bias and discrimination, it cover privacy, they cover democratic values, well-being, and economic inclusion. The chapter also links to the recommendation on enhancing access to and sharing of data. So that covers responsible data collection, data use, and data transfer and sharing. We have reference to the recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. And although that recommendation is very specific to neurotechnology, a lot of the overarching principles on responsible innovation and on the development of ethical novel technology can be applied more broadly and are applicable to this chapter. And then finally, the chapter also references digital security, specifically privacy by design, as well as considerations for the internet and the digital environment, using language from other guidances and guidelines in the OECD that cover those issues. So in the past, companies and other stakeholders and grievance mechanisms, such as the national contact points for RBC, would have had to rely on other chapters of the guidelines in order to bring forward complaints of violations of RBC expectations in unique tech situations. Now the guidelines are explicit on all these key issues. So take, for example, cases involving internet service providers shutting down access to political dissidents, or data centers sharing private information with authoritarian regimes, or algorithms spreading misinformation online in order to destabilize democratic processes. Many of these issues may not neatly fit into traditional perceptions of ESG impacts on society. So these updates expanding the scope of impacts covered by the guidelines really help ensure that the instrument stays evergreen, stays relevant. I've got one more slide, please. So before we hear from stakeholders on the panel about how they're operationalizing the M&E guidelines, let me just quickly introduce an exciting new project that the RBC and AI policy communities here at the OECD are starting to tackle. We call this project the RBC for Trustworthy AI. And our objective for this project is to more closely link the OECD AI principles with the M&E guidelines to understand how actors in the AI value chain can better meet expectations under the two instruments through the application of due diligence. And we're essentially taking the high-level principles from both the guidelines and the AI principles and really distilling them into practical recommendations. To do this, we're not only linking together the two instruments, but linking together the two policy communities. So this project is jointly overseen by both the Working Party on AI Governance and the Working Party on RBC here at the OECD. It draws on the technical expertise and network of experts from both the AI Policy Observatory and the OECD Center for RBC, with staff from the Secretariat embedded in both teams. And the way this project will work is that it first maps out RBC concepts related to AI. So that involves a mapping of what relevant risk management frameworks already exist, developing a consolidated understanding of risk management terminology, and then mapping out who the relevant actors and high priority risks are in AI value chains, and then developing an initial sense of how RBC due diligence expectations would apply to the various actors. So we're currently in phase 1 of this project. So phase 1 looks at what is, and then phase 2 and 3 look at what ought to be. So in phase 2, we'll put together what we learned from the existing frameworks and work to fill the gaps that we identified with best practice. And this best practice document could take a variety of forms. We can't assume at this point what it would look like, but the idea is that it would act as a sort of framework of frameworks that unites the M&E guidelines and the AI principles and other relevant international and national risk management frameworks on AI in a coherent way, in a way that's applicable to all actors in the AI value chain. So there is one coherent set of recommendations for actors in different jurisdictions to adhere to. And then finally, in the long term, we plan on evaluating the alignment of existing and new frameworks with this overarching framework to help ensure continued consistency and coherence over time. So that's it from me on the update of the chapter and on our work at the OECD. Keep an eye on OECD.ai and the RBC website for more information on that project, and we'll have initial findings of that mapping process to be published soon. So with that, I'd like to turn to the panel. So this panel will be divided into a few parts. We'll start with policymakers to hear about different approaches on how governments are incentivizing companies to implement due diligence on science, tech, and innovation issues. We'll then turn to a diverse group of stakeholders to hear about practical real-world application of these recommendations. And then finally, we'll close with an update and perspectives from our partners at the UN OHCHR to talk about how this links with the UN guiding principles and the work of the UN BTEC project. So I will first start with the EU. We are joined by Eamon Gilmore. Eamon is the EU Special Representative for Human Rights since 2019, and is also the former Deputy Head of Government of Ireland during a time of growth and transformation of the technology sector there. So I'm sure you have excellent perspectives to share, and we thank you for joining. Before I get into my question, I just want to say that the EU has only formally adhered to a small handful of OECD instruments, and we're proud to say that that includes the recently adopted OECD recommendation on the role of government in promoting RBC. So the EU is moving very quickly to put in place human rights due diligence requirements based off of OECD and UN standards, including some laws focused specifically on tech. So my question for Eamon is if you can please walk us through the broader EU human rights strategy on technology and maybe explain why the EU is using a risk-based due diligence approach to achieve its human rights objectives.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rashad, and thank you to the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct for the invitation to join you today. I think that the interface between business and science and technology, innovation and human rights is fascinating and challenging at the same time, and is developing so fast, I think that we're all challenged to keep up with it. But the one constant is that the human rights principles that underline it remain the same principles that apply online as they do offline. In the EU's case, our main roadmap for what we do on human rights and democracy in the world is the Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, which was adopted unanimously by all of the 27 member states. And one of the 5 pillars of that action plan is the relationship between technology and human rights. And when we're giving effect to that action plan, we use all of the tools available to us, and they include a reliance on responsible business conduct, because For example, all of the European Union's trade agreements contain a clause on human rights. The schemes of trade preferences, which give preferential access to the European Union market for imports from developing countries, there is a condition that there is compliance with human rights conventions and the various conventions of the International Labour Organization. The work of the OECD and the work that you are doing on responsible business conduct, science, technology, innovation, and human rights is hugely important to what the EU is doing, and the EU fully supports the update of the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And that is because the update upholds the high standards on human rights. The European Union has consistently referred to those guidelines in the various legislative proposals in the area of responsible business conduct. And I want to briefly mention some of the work which is ongoing. Firstly, on the broader area of responsible business conduct, which includes Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the Regulation on Deforestation-Free Products. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is now in its final stages, and that directive will require large companies operating in the EU market to identify and to address adverse human rights and environmental impacts in their own operations, as well as those of their subsidiaries and in their value chains. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive entered into force in January this year, and it requires large companies to report on the full range of sustainability issues, including environmental, social, and human rights and governance. The EU Deforestation-Free Products Regulation entered into force in June 2023, and that, we hope, will reduce the risks of violations to the human rights of indigenous peoples in particular. We also have the Battery Regulation, which entered into force in August, and which establishes due diligence obligations on the source of raw materials that are used for batteries, including with respect to human rights. Two other important pieces of legislation which are in preparation are the Forced Labour Product Ban Regulation, which will ban all products made with forced labour from the EU market, and also the regulation for critical raw materials, which will foster the use of socially responsible practices, including respect for human rights and meaningful engagement with local communities in the extraction of critical raw materials. On the non-legislative front, we're also working on an EU framework for implementing the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This is to provide coherence and coordination of actions taken by member states and the EU, particularly at international level. And in that context, I should say that 15 of the EU's member states have already adopted national action plans on the UN Guiding Principles. All of these developments aim to create a robust regulatory framework, and all of this aims to provide clarity and certainty for business, to minimize risks and to maximize opportunities, as well as, of course, to protect the rights of all those involved in business operations. And the same principle applies for technology. We believe that technology has the potential to promote and strengthen democracy, peace, and human rights through, for example, the documentation of human rights violations or abuses, and through providing access to certain rights, such as education and healthcare. But of course, there are many risks, and this is why due diligence is so important. The spread of internet shutdowns, the repression of internet freedoms by authoritarian governments, the use of digital tools to carry out mass and unlawful surveillance, cyber attacks, censorship, the spread of illegal content and disinformation are many of the challenges to the full enjoyment of human rights online. Last year, governments and other actors disrupted the internet on at least 187 times across 35 countries. And we've also seen the weaponization of shutdowns during armed conflict, for example, in Ukraine, Ethiopia, and Yemen. In line with the European Union's Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy and the European Union Council conclusions on digital diplomacy, which were adopted both in 2022 and 2023, the whole area of digital and human rights is now a major priority for the EU's external work to promote human rights. And so the EU promotes the right to privacy and data protection, addresses arbitrary and mass surveillance, and actively combats internet shutdowns, online censorship, hate speech online gender-based violence, information manipulation, disinformation, cybercrime, in full compliance with international human rights law. Through the whole spectrum of EU instruments, policies, legislative and regulatory advancements with a strong external dimension, the EU continues promoting its human-centered digital agenda as well as global alignment or convergence with EU norms and standards. Over the last few years, we have established strong standards of protecting data privacy, for example, through the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR regime, or combating hate speech online through the Code of Conduct with social media platforms. At the end of August, the Digital Services Act became legally enforceable for designated very large online platforms and very large online search engines. The Act aims to empower and to protect users online, including minors, by requiring the designated services to assess and mitigate their systemic risks and to provide robust content moderation tools. This sets out an unprecedented new standard for the accountability of online platforms regarding illegal conduct, disinformation, and other risks. At the same time, we're bringing forward the AI Act, which aims to set global standards for the development and use of artificial intelligence systems in the EU, following a risk-based approach for citizens' protection. That act, the AI Act, will build safeguards on the development and use of these technologies. Once the act is adopted, it will ensure that AI systems can be used in different applications, that they're analyzed and classified according to the risk they pose to users. And the different risk levels will mean more or less regulation. We are also using a series of other tools to combat online human rights violations, such as the strengthening of our dual-use export control for surveillance technology, and also using our emergency grants for human rights defenders to fund safe digital equipment for civil society organizations. Addressing the impact of digital technologies on human rights requires us all to take action. It requires a multi-stakeholder approach to policymaking that includes national authorities, national human rights institutions, academia, civil society, human rights defenders, journalists, international and regional organizations, and critically, the private sector. Working together makes us smarter, work more efficiently and more effectively. The developments in responsible business conduct, science, technology, and innovation are, I believe, all broadening the constituency for human rights. And this is a very positive development. And the most positive thing about this, I think, is the willingness of business itself to engage with this process, to shape it and to lead it. I think one of the most encouraging things that I have seen over the past 4.5 years in my role as the EU Special Representative for Human Rights is the willingness of business to cooperate with the European Union in developing this agenda. This, I believe, is good for human rights, but I also think it's good for business. And I want to thank the OECD for the work that you are doing in this area. And I want to appreciate the fact that we're able to use and build on that work in a practical way in the legislation and regulatory and promotional work that we're doing. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Wonderful, and thank you so much for those very detailed and very helpful remarks. I think they're really comprehensive in showing the entire kind of a spread of what we call the smart mix of policies and regulation and incentives available to companies to promote responsible business conduct. And I agree, we share your optimism and the positive potential of business to address these issues and to work with stakeholders to identify and mitigate risk and develop concrete recommendations on how to do so. I understand Eamon has to leave for a flight and won't be able to stick around for the Q&A, but if anyone does have questions for him, we'll be sure to forward them to his team and get an answer. Our next speaker is Valerie Santos. She works with the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in the U.S. Department of State, and is responsible for developing some important tech-specific national level due diligence guidance. I just like to welcome Valerie to the panel. Is she here? If you are, please turn on your camera. Perfect. Okay, I could see you now. So before I get into your question, so the most recent OECD declaration on promoting and enabling RBC in the global economy reaffirms the government commitment to create an enabling policy environment for RBC. That declaration was adopted at the first RBC ministerial earlier this year, which was co-chaired by the US and France. And in fact, the US has been particularly active on this front when it comes to responsible technology. Can you talk us through some of the ways the US is creating an enabling environment for RBC in tech?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak with all of you today. We were indeed proud to co-chair with France the Ministerial on Responsible Business Conduct that the OECD held in February. Thank you for highlighting the declaration that this meeting adopted. Digitalization and technology was a key topic in both the meeting and its declaration. The Biden-Harris administration has made it a priority to promote responsible and rights-respecting development, transfer, and use of technology, valuing the tremendous promise of critical and emerging technologies while managing the risks. During the Summit for Democracy, President Biden described how the United States and our allies and partners are working to ensure a responsible digital ecosystem built on trust and openness that reflects our democratic values and respects human rights. More recently, at an event during the UN General Assembly High-Level Week in September, Secretary Blinken noted how experts estimate AI can advance progress on nearly 80% of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and their targets to support food security, healthcare, and energy needs. He highlighted the United States' commitment to accelerating these efforts and maximizing the benefits of AI while managing the risks. We must ensure the development and use of these emerging technologies are managed in a responsible way. Innovation should not come at the expense of human rights. It is for that reason the Biden administration has taken several steps to mitigate risks of emerging technologies, including through developing the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, AI Risk Management Framework, the Executive Order on Advancing Biotechnology and Biomanufacturing Innovation for a Sustainable, Safe, and Secure American Bioeconomy, and the National Strategy to Advance Privacy-Preserving Data Sharing and Analytics. These documents offer guidance whenever these technologies or systems can meaningfully impact rights, opportunities, or access to information or services, and aim to improve user protections throughout the product lifecycle. In July, the administration announced its partnership with several leading tech companies, securing voluntary commitments from these companies to approach innovation with safety, security, and trust in mind. We are also undertaking efforts to counter the misuse of digital technologies, and the administration is taking a government-wide effort to counter the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware. We are concerned about the growing misuse of this technology to facilitate repression by targeting human rights defenders, journalists, and perceived critics. In this regard, President Biden signed an executive order in March that, for the first time, places restrictions on the government's operational use of commercial spyware that poses risks to national security or of human rights abuses by foreign governments. This executive order identifies concrete remedial steps the commercial spyware vendors can take to reduce identified risks, such as canceling relevant licensing agreements or contracts that present such risks. Some of these steps are elaborated in the human rights due diligence guidance that the State Department released in late 2020 for businesses seeking to prevent their products or services with surveillance capabilities from being misused by foreign governments to commit human rights abuses. This document was rooted in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises on Responsible Business Conduct. We were also pleased to recognize during the Summit for Democracy the work of the private sector to develop their own commitments to counter malicious cyber activities, including the misuse of spyware. Additionally, the U.S. government is using our export controls to address this issue. On July 18th, the U.S. Department of Commerce added 2 commercial spyware companies to the entity list, Intellexa and Cytrox, which builds on the addition of 4 other commercial spyware companies that we added to the entity list in November of 2021. The entity list restricts the export, re-export, and in-country transfer of goods and items to these companies. These companies engaged in activities that enabled the abuse of sophisticated surveillance tools, which threatened human rights and undermined democratic values. These measures serve as a strong signal to commercial spyware vendors that the U.S. government will take action against companies involved in proliferating and enabling the misuse of such tools. To the broader industry that facilitates the operations of such commercial spyware companies, and to those who may be considering investing in such entities. Taken together, these efforts support the private sector's role in ensuring an innovative and open digital ecosystem that respects human rights, including privacy, while mitigating the risks as new technologies emerge. Thank you.
Thanks, Valerie. We appreciate those remarks and also another comprehensive overview of the smart mix of measures. Can you just stick around for just a couple of minutes? I also want to ask if you could tell us more about how the U.S. is participating in international dialogues to help ensure consistent expectations across jurisdictions. Now, as we heard from Eamon, there's mandatory approaches, there's approaches mixed in with trade measures, and then we heard from you also trade measures, voluntary guidance. So is the U.S. working at a multilateral level to ensure expectations are consistent?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you for that question. In January, the United States assumed the chairship of the Freedom Online Coalition, a coalition of 38 governments that work together and engage with civil society and the private sector to advance internet freedom and promote respect for human rights, including the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, as well as privacy rights, both online and offline. Since the start of the year, the FOC has advanced principles for the government use of surveillance technologies to distinguish responsible practices from authoritarian practices. It is also finalizing a set of donor principles for the digital age and recently announced an intent to develop a pledge on responsible, rights-respecting AI for governments. We have also been delighted to welcome 3 new FOC members, Slovakia, Korea, and Chile, to join us in these efforts this year. These efforts add to the global discourse on norms and reinforce consistent expectations across countries for the digital ecosystem. During the Summit for Democracy in March, we announced progress on several multilateral fronts that will harmonize our vision for responsible business conduct. One example is the development of a code of conduct for the Export Controls and Human Rights Initiative. This is a multilateral effort with 24 other countries intended to counter state and non-state actors' misuse of goods and technology that violate human rights. The voluntary, non-binding written code of conduct outlines political commitments to apply export controls tools to prevent the proliferation of goods, software, and technologies that enable serious human rights abuses. One of the key features of this code is to exchange information on human rights due diligence, including through civil society and private sector engagements. We also issued with 10 other countries a joint statement on efforts to counter the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware. We committed to establishing robust guardrails and procedures to ensure that any commercial spyware use by our governments is consistent with respect for universal human rights and the rule of law. Working closely with industry partners and civil society groups to inform our approach, help raise awareness, and set appropriate standards, while also continuing to support innovation, better aligning our policies and export control authorities to mitigate collectively the misuse of commercial spyware and drive responsible business practices. These efforts will include encouraging industry and investment firms to follow the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises on Responsible Business Conduct. We are also working with the European Union through the Trade and Technology Council to promote and uphold an international rules-based order grounded in shared values. In May, we released a list of high-level principles both on the protection and empowerment of children and youth in the digital environment, as well as access to data for researchers to promote independent public interest research. And we are working to finalize platform guidance to protect human rights defenders online, developed in close consultations with tech companies and civil society, and announced during the previous TTC ministerial. And 70 international partners have joined the Declaration for the Future of the Internet to reaffirm the vision of an internet that is unified, facilitates economic opportunities, and supports human rights and fundamental freedoms, such as privacy, freedom of expression, and peaceful assembly. I will end by noting the growing chorus of like-minded voices that are pushing back against threats to democracy and doing so in consultation with business and civil society. We are stronger when we take coordinated actions and embrace industry's role in driving a digital future that respects human rights. Thanks.
Thanks again. Yes, good overview of multilateral efforts, of efforts that bring in non-OECD countries as well, and having joint statements, joint commitments. I think that's really important for business to hear that there's kind of a consistent, coherent set of recommendations coming at them and expectations because they're operating globally. I'd like to turn to our next speaker now, Surdas Mohit. He's the director of the AI and Data Policy Directorate at Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada. Thank you, Surdas, for joining. So we heard about various approaches from the EU side, from the US side, that make up the smart mix. As I understand, that includes mandatory requirements on companies to undertake due diligence, and like what is proposed in the AI and Data Act in Canada, which I understand you've had a role in helping craft. So can you walk us through that proposed legislation in more detail, and what other measures the Canadian government is undertaking with regards to RBC and science, tech, and innovation?
Sure, thanks, Rashad. Yeah, so as noted by other speakers and yourself, there's been a bit of concern around how some of these technologies are being used and impacts on human rights and privacy, and more generally questions around accountability and transparency in some of these activities. And I'm going to focus on AI specifically, but of course this also applies to a number of other activities. So as you noted, a big part of the addressing these kinds of issues, especially in a fast-moving space like AI, is having kind of a mix of different tools in your toolkit and being able to move at different speeds at the same time. So in the case of Canada, we have kind of a few different tools that we're using to address some of the concerns around AI. Right, one of them is obviously the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, which was tabled in Canadian Parliament last year. And before that, we had the Directive on Automated Decision Making, which was another kind of administrative rule that came from the Treasury Board Secretary in Canada. So that was focused on government use of AI. And so those are kind of like binding rules and regulations around AI, essentially. And those are built in kind of a flexible way, right? So I'll get into a bit more detail on AI and Data Act in a minute. But part of the approach here is to, bring out a set of rules, but be able to kind of have a bit of flexibility and not be too prescriptive around exactly how you're expecting responsible business conduct to happen. Then another tool is working on standards and codes. So for example, the Government of Canada is funding work on AI standards through the Standards Council of Canada, and of course that's a very international effort among a number of different countries to develop international standards that can then be used more broadly by businesses of all sizes. And more recently, the government also worked on voluntary code of conduct on generative AI specifically. So we launched a consultation in August, and we did that over the course of a month and a half, and worked with companies, but also civil society stakeholders and academics and other experts to kind of make sure we understood, well, what are the main risks that people are concerned about here, and what are the practices that we're seeing in the private sector? What are promising methods for making sure that we can kind of limit make sure that people are putting in place responsible practices around risks to human rights and safety, and ultimately ensuring kind of accountability and transparency over these systems to address public concerns. And then finally, I would kind of nod to international alignment. And so that's, again, kind of an evolving space, and it can move quite quickly at times. So, there's the Hiroshima AI process that was launched through the G7, again, on generative AI to try to ensure that, countries were coming to essentially common conclusions and developing common norms around how this technology is intended to be developed and deployed. And so really we're kind of trying to use all of these three kind of options together to ensure that there are common expectations for the private sector, and also that we're kind of building trust with Canadians and obviously people around the world, in terms of that there is responsible conduct being put in place around these technologies, and they have enough information, enough transparency, that they understand that companies are accountable for potential risks that are associated with the technology. So I'll jump into the Artificial and Data Act in a little more detail to give you an idea of kind of where we're going with that. And so the way the AI and Data Act works is, consistent with what you noted earlier, it's really a risk-based approach, right? So the idea is that it identifies the systems that are of greatest concern, pose potential significant risks to health and safety and human rights. And so those systems will be listed in classes through regulation under the title high impact systems. And so the way the Act works is that most of the requirements are essentially linked to these high impact systems. So the idea would be you set out these classes, and then there would be kind of a contextual set of regulations that applies to each class that would ensure that the risks that are associated with that class are addressed. So, for example, one of the classes that we mentioned in a publication that we published on this Act was systems relating to essentially determinations around access to services and employment and those kinds of activities. So, and that's really a cornerstone of human rights law in Canada. There's a Canadian Human Rights Act that currently governs discrimination in those contexts. And this is really intended to bring a more kind of proactive, risk-based system to those same kinds of activities, but in the AI context. So it's sort of to your point earlier around ensuring that measures are being taken throughout the life cycle to ensure that risks to human rights are being considered. And then there'll be a number of other systems as well, including systems using biometric information, systems used for healthcare purposes, and systems of social media, and so on. So each of these different classes would have some distinct risks associated with them, and then there would be kind of a regulatory framework associated with each. And the big part of the ADA approach is to have a certain amount of regulatory flexibility. So it kind of lays out a legislative framework that lays out the core kind of principles and expectations of private sector actors. And then the requirements would be developed through regulations, would be dependent on standards, and could evolve essentially as the technology changes and the risk changes, and the way that systems work kind of advances. And then again here, as I noted, is that international alignment context. So with the AI and Data Act, we're in contact with other, we're kind of working with other countries to understand how their frameworks are evolving, so including the European Union's AI Act. And we're trying to ensure that the two instruments are essentially interoperable, so that if you're operating systems in Canada and the EU, then you're able to meet both requirements kind of without completely different sets of measures. So we have that flexibility, but we also have, so we set out a series of principles on which those will be based. And so the real bedrock ones are around accountability and transparency. So, when you're thinking about a responsible business conduct, first you need to have, organizations need to have in place appropriate accountability structures and policies and processes to ensure that they actually are able to be accountable. They are able to make commitments. They are able to put in place measures reliably. So that's kind of the accountability pillar. And then transparency, I think as AI has advanced, and it's quite a, it's a technical area, it's something that a lot of people don't understand. And so it's really just a question of, requiring organizations to put out kind of descriptions of, how AI systems are being used for purposes described in the classes, and depending on the type of system, exactly what information would be involved. So with respect to the code of conduct, for example, on generative AI, there's some additional kind of measures in there around ensuring that content can be detected, particularly audiovisual content, and such as through watermarking or that sort of thing. So this is an area where those requirements will evolve as system capabilities evolve, of course. And then another key principle is human oversight, right? So and this is similar to what's in the European Union as well, in terms of making sure that the companies deploying an AI system, that they are monitoring it, they are able to understand kind of what's happening with the system, identify where risks may be materializing, or where things may not be working as they originally had planned. From a harms perspective, the two key pillars there are fairness and equity and safety. So we want to ensure that systems are being assessed for bias and aren't discriminating unfairly against people. We want to make sure that systems are safe, and that potential risk of physical or psychological harm have been assessed, and that there's been sufficient kind of due diligence there. And then finally, there's the aspect of validity and robustness, where systems have been tested, and the organization kind of putting them out understands how they're going to operate under different circumstances, and that they are essentially operating as intended under all the different circumstances where the system may be exposed. So those are kind of the key ideas, and there's also kind of a fairly flexible kind of enforcement framework that's set up, where there would be an artificial intelligence and data commissioner who would kind of work with other regulators in the AI space, of which there are many, so including like health regulators, financial regulators. So it's intended to set up a flexible structure where this new commissioner would be kind of responsible for the systems and the classes and the requirements under ADA, but would work quite closely with other regulators, and where, say, for example, a financial regulator might be more maybe better positioned to look at certain systems in the financial sector, then they could do that. And there would be kind of coordination to avoid kind of duplication or just inefficiency in the system, and ensuring that there's a coherent approach across the board, and that Canadians can feel like systems that they're using are have consistent protections across the board. So that's kind of the basic idea of the AI and Data Act. Happy to answer further questions later. I'll jump into the code of conduct on generative AI for just a minute, and then I'll hand it over to the next person. But so with the code of conduct, the idea there was that we have the AI and Data Act that's in Parliament. It still will be a bit of time before it comes into force, and a lot of questions kind of circling around generative AI. A lot of concern among different kinds of concerns among experts and other stakeholders around different possible risks, and the fact that it's advancing so quickly in terms of capabilities that that's caused a lot of concern internationally. So the idea of the code of conduct there, as I mentioned earlier, is really to just kind of identify a set of practices that would, at least in the near term, kind of define what responsible conduct looks like at a high level, and then that would kind of form kind of a bridge to regulation of the AI and Data Act. So the idea is to kind of have two instruments that are working at different speeds, and that ultimately are the code of conduct is not a substitute for regulations, but that it would at least provide some expectations in the near term. And going forward, as new technologies and new AI systems are developed, then it would also be possible to kind of work quickly on these kinds of consultations and develop a more agile way of addressing risks that are coming up and are generating really rapid response kind of concerns. And so to be able to kind of reassure the public that we kind of we're developing an understanding of how these systems are working, what the risks are, and that businesses are putting in place the right kind of measures throughout the life cycle to ensure that they have a handle on risks, and and as you noted earlier, reasonably foreseeable harms and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'll leave it there, but happy to answer any questions as well.
Excellent, thanks. And I just want to highlight a great point you made right up front, but also that kind of echoed throughout your remarks. And then that's on the importance of flexibility when dealing with both with quickly evolving tech like AI, but also with a concept like due diligence and risk-based due diligence, even mandatory due diligence, which requires a bit of flexibility in order for business to take an approach tailored to their specific circumstances. But also requires some transparency about why they're taking specific risk mitigation steps. So they need to know and show, and flexibility and transparency, which you say are built into the AI and Data Act, which is excellent to see. Also nice to see some other OECD AI principles brought out there. So accountability, human oversight, robustness, well-being, safety. That's all great to hear, and it sounds like it's designed to take into account a lot of these really important aspects and be interoperable as well. So yeah, thank you for that overview. That was very helpful. That'll round it out for our speakers from the policymaker perspective. I'd like to now turn to our stakeholders who can give us the private sector perspective and the civil society perspective. So I'll first call on Pamela Wood to join us. She's from Hewlett Packard Enterprise. She's the manager of the Human Rights and Supply Chain Responsibility team at HPE and is definitely no stranger to the RBC space. Thank you, Pam, for joining us. As we heard earlier, issues such as data governance, responsible online platforms, the development and use of AI, due diligence on customers, these are all focus areas of the updated guidelines chapter. But these expectations aren't necessarily new. They're definitely not new to companies who have been in this space and who've been grappling with these issues for a number of years. So HPE is definitely involved in those discussions. I was hoping you can give us some examples about how you're directly operationalizing the guidelines in your day-to-day and where you see some of the biggest challenges.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Just as a bit of context, I lead our human rights work and team at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, which works across our whole value chain, both up and downstream. It's an honor to be here, especially since I clearly recall being at the OECD, engaging in consultation leading up to the 2011 version of the M&E guidelines. So OECD's updated M&E guidelines come at a very important moment in time for human rights. As a human rights professional within a company, it's exciting to see and be part of an increase in corporate ESG activity, elevation of standards like this, human rights due diligence regulation, AI regulation, and increased civil society action. But it also comes with a high level of responsibility for companies. At Hewlett Packard Enterprise, we're pretty thankful to have been working, as Rashad mentioned, on human rights for well over a decade, to already have robust policies, practices, and leadership support that really aligns with existing international standards, OECD, UNGPs, for example, and puts us in a better position than most to align with advancing standards and all of this abundance of new regulation, as well as expectations from our various stakeholders. To answer your questions, what I'll do is I'll share how we align with these standards, some examples in specifically the AI ethics work that we do, and in responsible use of our technology. And I'll finish by highlighting a few of the challenges that I think that are not unique to HP, but speaking more broadly in terms of the tech industry. So we implement international standards on human rights through a risk-based approach. We've done it this way since our first policy on human rights. This means that we embed human rights due diligence in how we work across the business. We provide access to remedy, and we aim to elevate voices and engagement with key rights holders. Our company and value chain-wide human rights impact assessment, which we do very regularly, usually every 3 years, confirms our salient human rights risks and areas for continuous improvement. And I mention this because one of our 6 salient risks that we identified in our penultimate HRA was responsible product development. And this was back in 2019, and for which we decided the technology that perhaps has the most potential for harm, usually in the case of AI, unintentional harm, but also, of course, could be nefarious harm, really is AI. So we've been drilling and focusing our efforts on responsible product development in the AI ethics space. And it was based on these human rights findings and our human rights aims, objectives, and policy that in 2020, we were able to launch our AI ethics governance. And this includes our HP AI Ethics Responsibility Committee to provide oversight and direction from senior executive level on all of our efforts in this space. And this is a broad group of folks who represent various business groups across the company. At the same time, back in 2020, we established our AI Ethics Working Group, for which I co-chair along with our chief architect in Hewlett-Packard Labs. And this membership is also pan-HP and has really strong representation, which I am daily thankful for, from technical experts within our company. So we have a range of folks with more ethical or legal or HR type backgrounds, as well as those who are data scientists and really working with AI on a daily basis. And our first task back in 2020 was to develop our HP AI ethical principles of privacy enabled and secure, human focused, inclusive, responsible, and robust. And it was actually a really long process of reviewing best practice in published principles that already existed at the time and tailoring our principles to our unique needs on AI. And it is worth calling out. At the time, I recall our heavy review of existing principles, and it was the OECD AI principles that were hugely informative in our process. And HP's principles, really now that we have those in place, they've provided our framework for guiding all of our work in this space, from how we strategize our AI ethics to the training that we give to the assessments that we do. And the second task of our AI Ethics Working Group back in 2020 was establishing our process and tools for assessing any AI that our company was developing, AI that we were sourcing to integrate into our solutions, and AI that we were sourcing to use internally. And I mention this because it put us in quite a good position to start thinking about all these new risks that more heightened AI, or I guess more intelligent AI, such as generative AI, the risks that they present. And our assessments are at the core of our AI ethics work. So we leverage team members' awareness and internal alert mechanisms to identify potential new products, new uses, partnerships that may pose risk to people. So once an AI is submitted through our AI intake form, we assign an assessment team based on risk, schedule a meeting with all parties to understand the technology and collectively identify risks and safeguards. And then we provide that summary of risks and recommendations back to our colleagues, and we, the AI Ethics Working Group, remain on hand to support as they pursue implementation. Very closely to our AI ethics work ties our responsible use work. And in this space, we consider who wishes to purchase our products and how, more importantly, will they use them? And how, therefore, do we deploy or promote deployment of our technology, including AI, with safeguards that prevent harm or unintentional harm? And we do this as well by embedding screenings or alerts, this time into business processes more on the sales side. And this allows us to operate human rights screenings and intervention on sales with potential high risk, including human rights due diligence in countries of risk and where products or use cases may increase risk. Likewise, we apply human rights due diligence with a risk-based approach in line with these standards to all acquisitions and investments, and with new critical partners such as suppliers before we start working with them. Over the last year, we prioritized the advancement of our downstream human rights due diligence, and Rashad really talked about how this is a unique point within the M&E guidelines that have just been published. And so we're really excited about our work there and how we work with our whole range of partners on the sales side. So thinking of resellers, distributors, etc. And we've delivered human rights training to different groups across HP and our value chain. So we've been busy, especially this year, continuing to research, promote, and engage on human rights in our sales channel. And what we find is it's such a big space. Yeah, I think Rashad kind of pointed this out at the beginning, where there's not just a simple supply chain and a sales chain that exists in electronics, but really it's a supply and sales web. And those interdependencies really do mean that we can only do so much on our own. So to help foster this collaboration and downstream due diligence, HP recently brought together a few peer companies, and we commissioned independent human rights experts, BSR, to research practices in the tech sales value chain. And we were able to publish our collective findings, and you can read about this work in BSR's blog titled Best Practices for Human Rights Due Diligence in Tech Sales Channels, and a related best practice brief that exists on the website there as well. So we also continue to contribute. We find it very helpful. All of these areas are just continuous improvement areas and areas where everyone is learning as we go. So we find it very valuable to be collaborators, to contribute to discussions, and actively participate in forums that aim to highlight and encourage best practice across the use of tech. And this includes UNBTech's Community of Practice, which I'm sure Lenny will be talking about soon, as well as OECD's expert group on AI risk and accountability. Finally, in terms of, go ahead.
No, sorry, Pamela, sorry to cut you off. I'm seeing that we're running a little bit low on time and we still have a few speakers left. So I'm going to have to jump in here, but thank you so much. I think these were excellent points and very practical. If you want to wrap it up, just a few words, otherwise I can move to the next speaker.
Sure, I think I'll just wrap it up by highlighting very briefly, I think, 3 challenges that we're noting in implementation here. And this is really around challenges across technology actors as a whole. And I would say that would be in the cohesion and alignment of many emerging regulations on both AI and human rights due diligence. As well, the need for collaboration, as I pointed out, it's a very big space of many actors. And finally, thirdly, a general need to really elevate the S in ESG. I think this is a great moment for us collectively to really highlight the work of human rights and the importance of it.
Excellent, thank you, and thanks for highlighting also those challenges, best practice challenges, really practical use cases kind of brought out with that intervention and really helpful. If you don't mind putting that blog you mentioned in the chat, I think that would be also helpful to circulate to our users. So next I'll turn to Jason Pielmeyer. He's the Executive Director of the Global Network Initiative. The Global Network Initiative offers a more bird's eye view of company implementation, particularly when it comes to privacy, data, and freedom online. In your view, what are companies doing well, but also where have they fallen short? And then related to this, if you can also address, it'd be great to hear your view on the efficacy of voluntary initiatives and also collective action. So if you can get into that, and also very briefly introduce what GNI is for our audience. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Rashad. So very quickly, Global Network Initiative, GNI, is a multi-stakeholder initiative. We bring together companies from across the ICT stack, together with civil society organizations, academics, and investors. We've been doing that for 15 years, and we do that around, in particular, the respect and protect for freedom of expression and privacy. And we have a particular focus in looking at the way that companies and governments interact. So we now have 90 members from around the world. It's a really diverse expert group. And we've been paying a lot of attention to the OECD framework. The GNI principles were developed 15 years ago, very much in conversation with the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework that became the UN Guiding Principles. 5 years ago, we did a cleanup and refresh of the principles to ensure they maintained alignment with the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines. So we were very eager and happy to participate in the consultation around the update to the guidelines, and particularly pleased to see the developments in the Science, Technology, and Innovation chapter that Rashad outlined at the beginning. So quickly to your questions, Rashad, so I'm just going to put the submission that we made to the guidelines in the chat, in case anyone wants to take a look at that. In terms of what companies are doing well, so GNI has these principles that I alluded to, which guide company conduct, and they not only sort of are an aspirational framework, but they are the core of a unique assessment process that GNI implements, whereby companies that join GNI agree to undergo periodic review by independent assessors to demonstrate how they are implementing the GNI principles and our more detailed implementation guidelines. That process, which we call assessment, is an accountability function, and the reports that are generated look for both evidence of implementation, so that's internal systems and policies, as well as trainings, transparency mechanisms, stakeholder engagement. We also look at case studies, importantly, to see how these systems and policies are working in practice. So those reports are confidential. They involve a lot of sensitive information, non-public information, including about how companies are interfacing with governments. And we then take a look at them as a GNI board with representation from this broad set of stakeholders to determine whether each company is implementing our principles and guidelines in good faith with improvement over time. That assessment process, our most recent cycle of that assessment process just concluded last year. And it was really, and we were just about to publish our public assessment report that will identify a lot of the content that was discussed. Some of that will be anonymized to protect the ability of our companies to continue pushing back on overbroad government demands and restrictions. But I want to tease that a little bit and just say that a lot of progress has been identified in just this last cycle. And I think if we take a step back and look back 15 years over the course of GNI's lifespan, it's really remarkable how much progress has been made, at least with respect to those companies participating in GNI, but I think more broadly as well across the technology sector. And a lot of that is due to the good work that the OECD, UN, and others have been doing as well. Specifically, we've seen progress around embedding human rights in high-level commitments that companies are making, as well as internal processes and policies. The inclusion of board oversight and involvement in the implementation of those human rights commitments and policies, expansion of internal expertise and training across the company and relevant business units. Human rights due diligence, obviously a huge area where we've seen a lot more experimentation, a lot more transparency, a lot more success in terms of effectively identifying and then being able to mitigate human rights risks. And then transparency more generally, companies have been putting more and more information out into the public about the kinds of challenges they face and the ways that they're trying to address them. Specifically, I'll say, related to that, we've identified some areas for additional, where we're starting to see some really great innovation and where we can continue to do more. And that's around cross-sector collaboration on risk identification and mitigation. So that we really appreciate that there's language in the updated guidelines on collaborating to pool leverage. I think that is an area that is a tactic that is particularly relevant for the tech sector, where if you take a look at any particular human rights impact, there are going to be companies that are directly sort of involved, but then many other companies behind it in the tech ecosystem who might have a role that they could play. We recently developed a tool with BSR that helps companies understand those interrelationships and other stakeholders as well. So I just put a link to that in the chat. Quickly, Rashad, on your second question, the falling short, I think there are a lot of challenges that are only getting more complicated in the sort of context of government company interactions. In particular, we are seeing governments increasingly regulating technology, sometimes with positive human rights impacts, but oftentimes with either unintended or potentially, in fact, intended negative human rights impacts. One example that I'll just throw out is challenges and risks to staff on the ground, right? So companies, for example, in the telecom sector have long had to grapple with the fact that they have personnel in country, in where there are circumstances where the government is making demands either to shut down communications channels or get access to certain data. those individuals can be vulnerable to direct pressure. The GNI principles actually identify that as a human rights risk, the risk to the safety of company personnel. We were a little bit disappointed that that wasn't more directly and explicitly identified in this round of revisions as a challenge, and more generally that we think that the risks posed by governments to technology companies and their abilities to protect human rights is something that could have been more fully addressed in the updates, which is one of the things that we recommended. Another area for improvement, I think, is, and this should be well recognized, is stakeholder engagement. It is clearly a critical part of effective human rights due diligence. We really do appreciate that this is something that got expanded attention in the updates as well, and want to just say that, you know, we are seeing more and more stakeholder engagement happen, which is a good thing. But as a result of that, we're also feeling consequences from civil society, you know, concerns about engagement fatigue, power imbalances, lack of follow-up. So we're thinking very hard within GNI about how we can work collaboratively to improve the relationships between tech companies and stakeholders, so that that stakeholder engagement can be more consistent, build more trust to really foster more meaningful engagement. I want to just close, Rashad.
Thanks, Jason. Sorry, we only have 10 minutes left, and I hate to cut you off while you're making an important point, but we have 10 minutes left and 2 speakers, so I think we're going to have to just jump to the next speaker. I'm really sorry about that. I'm not great at time management, and you all are paying the price. Thank you. So I just want to point out our final stakeholder panelist. That's Lucy Purdon. She's the Senior Tech Policy Fellow at Mozilla Foundation. Lucy, I know you've been in this space for quite a while and have direct experience on evaluating company implementation of RBC expectations, and also with the National Contact Point mechanism, which I think is very important to that you had that experience. So can you explain how you've seen the space evolve in the last decade, and then maybe what you'd like to see from the civil society perspective of how the policy community can improve efforts to promote implementation of these principles in the tech sector and bring remedy and accountability to the tech sector?
Thank you so much.
Please be brief. Sorry. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I was really nodding furiously at Jason's last comments there on stakeholder engagements. This is a nice link in. So yes, I've worked on technology and human rights over the past decade. And when I started working in this space in the early 2010s, it was a very different landscape to now. It was around the time of the Arab Spring. You know, civil society and tech companies were more aligned because of this joint opposition towards the actions of governments, whether that was network shutdown orders, censorship, or requests for user data. But this honeymoon period, if you will, it wore off quite quickly as impacts of the ICT sector came to light and more public knowledge about business models of internet companies around monetizing data, scattergun approaches to censorship, and crucially, the rise of mass surveillance and the total lack of transparency that came with that. And this really built frustration among civil society, and the relationship started to shift between tech companies and civil society. So the first revisions of the M&E guidelines, you know, which built on the UNGPs, it named the ICT sector, specifically included impacts on freedom of expression and privacy, and really strengthened the possibility for bringing cases for mediation to national contact points. Now, this was a real signal to civil society that the OECD was in the game, and boy, did we start to test this mechanism. So really, the NCPs found themselves squarely in the eye of the storm, particularly as the opposition to mass surveillance was building around the world. And, you know, looking back on the complaints prior to 2011, most of the complaints that were brought to NCPs around the tech sector had been around labor rights in the supply chain or corruption. And this really changed. And over the past decades, the NCPs have been witness to some of the most serious and high stakes impacts of the ICT sector. You've got surveillance, internet shutdowns, drone strikes, spyware, and most recently about how a telco exited Myanmar after the coup. So I wanted to highlight a couple of events that I think were really significant. 2013 was a big year for NCPs in terms of mass surveillance complaints. Privacy International, who I used to work for, not at this time, but previously brought complaints about spyware companies to the attention of the NCPs in the UK and Germany regarding Gamma. You might remember it sold Finfisher, and this was in the context of Bahrain. Now, the nature of this complaint was a real challenge to NCPs because surveillance posed this particular problem when talking about business relationships, because it was often the business relationship with another government that was under question. And this brought in a very thorny issue of national security. Also, the mediation required transparency, but the issue of mass surveillance was shrouded in secrecy, which made this very difficult to mediate. And also, the companies often just did not engage with the process. So even though in the UK NCP and Gamma case, there was found to be a breach of the guidelines, there was no due diligence, there was no communication, Gamma just didn't engage. And because you couldn't compel them to say that they did sell spyware to Bahrain, the burden of providing evidence was on civil society, which is very, very difficult. And a lot of complaints around this have been rejected on that basis. Now, I raised this case because this was an absolute precursor to a lot of the commercial spyware issues that we see now, especially the NSO group and Pegasus, which is very high profile. And it seems like a lot of lessons could have been learned at that time about the direction of travel of surveillance around the world. And it's worth wondering what could have been avoided if there had been more severe consequences on a company like Gamma. So it will be interesting to see how the enhanced due diligence in the updated guidelines plays out and the government efforts to get these smaller companies to engage. But of course, mass surveillance isn't all about commercial spyware, and there were also complaints brought to the NCPs after the Snowden revelations with regard to UK telcos collaborating with GCHQ under a program called Tempora, which is about access to the fiber optic networks. Now, these were dismissed because of lack of evidence. Those cases were eventually brought to the European Court of Human Rights, which of course is about government responsibility. But since then, I think we are seeing more companies push back on legislation that compels them to be complicit in negative human rights impacts. And I focus on this example of mass surveillance because if history does repeat itself, I wonder if this update, of the MNE guidelines might signal another flurry of engagement for NCPs. So in the past decade, they were in the eye of the storm when it came to mass surveillance. That issue hasn't gone away. But in this decade, the NCPs might be in the same position when it comes to impacts of AI. So hopefully these updated guidelines, based on this decade of experience dealing with very complex technology and impacts and lack of transparency, will give the NCPs more of a steer in dealing with the impacts of AI and enable the community to act faster.
Thanks so much, Lucy, and I appreciate you going through that very quickly, and great that we appreciate that call to action for the NCPs, and we hope to see progress on that front as well. And for those who are watching and aren't familiar with the NCP mechanism, it's a really important mechanism to bring remedy and pushing for accountability in the sector. So please do read about that on our website. I'd finally like to close out the panel with important perspectives from our key partner in this space, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We're joined by Lena Wendland, who is the chief of the Business and Human Rights Unit there. Lena, we'd like your final perspectives. Can you tell us more about the work of your BTEC project, which is quite relevant for this space? And what are some key implementation challenges that you've observed since that project got off the ground, and particularly with the responsible development and use of technology? So please, Lena, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Rashad. And I realized that I'm 2 minutes out from the deadline. So there were a lot of things I would have liked to say, but it's also been really fascinating to hear everyone else's perspective. So I'll make it really a very quick run through. First of all, I want to congratulate the OECD on the update of the guidelines. I think this was a really important process. I recognize the challenges, and I do congratulate everybody, both in the OECD Secretariat and also states and stakeholders, to get there, because I do think that there were some important clarifications based on a decade's worth of work in this space, and also in the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, that was important to bring out more strongly in the reflect that experience in the updated guidelines. So more specifically, I mean, I could say I had a lot of talking points about the importance of this alignment on convergence and how important it is, and how much we value our collaboration with the OECD broadly in the business and human rights responsible business conduct space. But I will jump to specifically the tech chapter, which is of more direct interest to this meeting. And this was, as everyone will recognize, a very timely and very needed update, and we're very pleased with a number of the things. And I won't go into too many details, but we particularly appreciate and strongly welcome the value chain, the inclusion of use as well, value chain approach. Rashad gave a good overview of the developments, and I think that those are some that we will really also benefit from in the work that we are doing. We also welcome the new expectations set out in the chapter about enterprises carrying out risk-based due diligence, making the links to the other chapters, as Rashad has mentioned, including from our side, of course, most importantly, the human rights chapter. So really linking the area of human rights due diligence also in relation to the adverse risks and impacts from digital technology. So I think there's a lot to celebrate, and we really value the continued engagement also as a member of the OECD's expert network of experts for the project RBC for Trustworthy AI. So we do collaborate, and I want to do also take the opportunity to also mention that we are engaging as well, or the OECD is engaging with us in this case in our BTEC project. So the UN Human Rights BTEC project that many will be familiar with, I think Pamela referred to it. She is a member of the HBE, is a member of our community of practice. BTEC is essentially about applying the lens of the UN guiding principles to the space of digital technologies. We launched the project back in 2019, so we already have a number of resources for various covering various aspects of the interface between business and human rights and technology. And I believe I have shared the link to the BTEC portal in the chat. Most recently in June this year, we launched a work stream as part of the BTEC project focused specifically on generative AI, and we will launch a series of papers, foundational papers and other outputs at the UN Annual Forum on Business and Human Rights in Geneva at the end of November this year. And I really strongly urge and welcome everyone who is interested to both, if you are able to travel to Geneva, but I think there's a virtual option to join that session. And I'll also just plug, we have on the 30th of November an event that we are convening in collaboration with GNI and BSR on to sort of further drill down on some of the findings we're doing in the project. So this was really a very speedy work through, but the bottom line is I welcome and congratulate on the update, including and not least on the chapter on science and technology, and really appreciate the alignment and the collaboration with the OECD also, as they in their strong track record and work on the RBC angle as well of AI. And thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Lena, and apologies again for those forcing you into those speedy remarks. I think want to thank all of our speakers. I think all of your remarks were excellent. And just so everyone knows, before I close out this meeting, we have another webinar very similar to this on the environment chapter of the M&E guidelines. That'll be happening on the 19th of October. You should look for that and register for that. And then I cut off Lena and Jason, but I know that they'll have events at the end of the month on October 24th and 25th in Brussels, also on generative AI and on an online platform. So I encourage you to check out those events as well if you want to hear more about this conversation. Thank you again to all of the speakers, and thank you to our comms team for setting this up. And that'll be all for us. And remember, you can find a recording of this webinar on our website if you'd like to share it more broadly. Thank you.